driving for a rideshare company back in March 2020, right when everything started getting really weird with the pandemic. Business was slow, and I was desperate for any ride I could get since most people were staying home. It was around 10:30 p.m. on a Tuesday when I got a ping from the bowling alley on Riverside Drive. You know, the old strike zone that had been closed for like 2 weeks already because of all the lockdown stuff. I thought it was strange someone would be there, but hey, maybe they were just walking by or something. When I pulled into the parking lot, it was completely empty except for this one guy standing under the flickering streetlight near the entrance. He was tall, maybe in his 30s, wearing dark jeans and a black hoodie pulled up over his head. What struck me immediately was how still he was, like unnaturally still. Most people are looking at their phones or moving around a bit when they're waiting, but this guy was just standing there like a statue. I rolled down my window and called out, "Derek?" And he nodded once, then walked over to my car. The whole parking lot felt wrong, you know? Like when you're in a place that should have people but doesn't, and your brain keeps telling you something's off. Derek got in the back seat without saying a word, and I immediately noticed he smelled like nothing. That probably sounds weird, but everyone has some kind of scent. Cologne, laundry detergent, cigarettes, whatever. This guy had absolutely no smell at all, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd reeked. I tried the usual small talk, asking how his night was going, if he'd been at the bowling alley before it closed, but he just stared straight ahead and didn't respond. Not even a grunt or acknowledgement that I'd spoken. The silence in the car was so thick it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. After about 30 seconds of this, he finally spoke up and said, "Take Elm Street North for about 4 miles, then I'll tell you where to turn." His voice was flat, monotone, like he was reading from a script. I glanced in the rearview mirror to get a better look at his face, but the hoodie cast this shadow that made it impossible to see his features clearly. All I could make out were his eyes, and they seemed to be reflecting the streetlights in a way that didn't look quite right. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, already feeling like this was going to be one of those rides I'd remember for all the wrong reasons. As we drove down Elm Street, Derek didn't say another word until we hit the 4-mile mark, and then he just pointed to the right and said, "Turn here." There wasn't even a real street, just this narrow gravel road that looked like it led into the woods. My GPS was showing nothing, just blank space, which should have been my first red flag to end the ride right there. But I needed the money, and technically he was giving me directions. So I figured maybe he lived in some rural area that wasn't properly mapped yet. The gravel crunched under my tires as we went deeper into what felt like the middle of nowhere. No streetlights, no other houses, just thick trees on both sides creating this tunnel effect with my headlights. After about 10 minutes of driving through this creepy backwoods road, Derek told me to stop in front of what I can only describe as the most rundown house I'd ever seen. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Boarded up windows, sagging roof, weeds growing up through the porch boards. Paint was peeling off in long strips, and there was this weird dark stain running down the front wall from under one of the boarded windows. I turned around to ask if he was sure this was the right place, but before I could get the words out, Derek was already opening the door. "Wait here," he said, and those were the first 2 words he'd spoken since giving me directions. He got out and walked around the side of the house, disappearing into the shadows between the building and the tree line. I sat there with my engine running, checking my phone every few seconds. But there was no cell service out here. The silence was absolute except for my car's engine, and I started getting that crawling feeling on the back of my neck like someone was watching me. I kept looking in my mirrors, expecting to see something moving in the trees, but there was nothing. Just darkness so complete it felt solid. After about 15 minutes, I was seriously considering just leaving. The whole situation felt wrong on every level, and my gut was screaming at me to get out of there. But then I heard footsteps on gravel, and Derek appeared again, walking back toward my car from the same direction he'd gone. He got in without explanation, closed the door, and sat there in that same unnaturally still way. I waited for him to tell me the ride was over, or give me a new destination, but he just stared straight ahead like he was processing something. Finally, after what felt like forever, he spoke up and said, "I need to go to the other place now." When I asked him what other place, he just repeated it. The other place. No address, no explanation, nothing. I tried asking Derek for an actual address or at least some kind of direction, but he just kept saying the other place like that was supposed to mean something to me. This went on for maybe 5 minutes. Me asking for clarification and him giving me the same non-answer over and over again. His voice never changed tone, never showed any frustration or impatience, which somehow made it even more unnerving. Finally, I told him I couldn't take him somewhere if he wouldn't tell me where it was, and that's when he said something that made my blood run cold. "You'll know when we get there." Not "I'll tell you when we get there," or "I'll recognize it when I see it," but "you'll know." Like I was supposed to have some kind of psychic connection to wherever this place was. Against every instinct I had, I started driving back toward the main road, hoping he'd eventually give me real directions. But as we drove, Derek started doing this thing where he'd point left or right at random intersections, never saying turn, just pointing. And the weird thing was, every time he pointed, I felt this compulsion to follow his direction, like my hands were turning the wheel before my brain had time to process what was happening. We drove around for what felt like hours, winding through back roads I'd never seen before, getting further and further away from any area I recognized. The whole time, Derek never moved from his position, sitting perfectly straight, staring ahead, only lifting his arm to point when we came to a turn. I kept trying to make conversation, asking about his day, the weather, anything to break the silence, but it was like talking to a wall. At one point, I glanced in the rearview mirror and I swear I couldn't see him breathing. His chest wasn't moving up and down like it should have been, and that's when I really started to panic. I pulled over at a gas station to get my bearings and hopefully get him out of my car, but when I turned around to tell him we were stopping, he was staring directly at me in the mirror, not looking around or checking his phone, staring right into my eyes through the reflection. His eyes looked completely black in the mirror, no whites visible at all, and I felt this wave of cold wash over me like someone had dumped ice water down my back. "This isn't the other place," he said, and his voice sounded different now, deeper, with this weird echo like he was speaking from inside a tunnel. I quickly pulled back onto the road, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, just wanting this nightmare ride to be over. After another hour of this bizarre driving tour through roads that seemed to lead nowhere, Derek suddenly said, "Take me back." Just like that, no explanation, no mention of the other place anymore. I was so relieved I almost laughed out loud, but something in his tone made me keep my mouth shut. I turned around and started heading back toward the bowling alley. But here's the thing that still messes with my head. I couldn't remember the route we'd taken to get where we were. It was like my memory of the last 2 hours was just fuzzy. I knew we'd been driving, I knew we'd made turns, but when I tried to picture the actual roads or landmarks, it was all blank. I had to rely on my GPS to get back to Riverside Drive, which should have been impossible since I'd been driving in the area for months and knew it pretty well. The whole drive back, Derek went back to his original statue-like position, not moving, not speaking, just existing in my back seat like some kind of human-shaped void. I kept glancing in the mirror, trying to get a better look at his face, but that shadow from his hoodie never seemed to shift no matter how the streetlights hit it. By the time we pulled into the bowling alley parking lot, it was almost 2 a.m., and I felt like I'd been awake for days. Derek didn't get out right away when I stopped the car. He just sat there for maybe 30 seconds, and I could feel him staring at the back of my head. Then he leaned forward and I felt his breath on my neck. Except it wasn't warm like breath should be, it was cold, like air conditioning. "You picked the wrong guy up tonight," he said, and his voice was right in my ear, so quiet I almost wasn't sure I'd heard it correctly. Before I could ask what he meant, he was out of the car and walking away toward the same spot where I'd picked him up. I watched him in my side mirror and he just stopped under that flickering streetlight and stood there, perfectly still again. I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened, checking the ride details on my app to see how much I'd made and how long the trip had taken. But here's where it gets really weird. When I opened the app, there was no record of the ride. No trip details, no payment processing, no Derek, nothing. It was like the entire thing had never happened, except I could still smell that strange absence of smell in my back seat, and my gas tank was nearly empty when it had been 3/4 full when I started the night. I tried refreshing the app about 20 times, thinking it was just a glitch or maybe a delayed upload because of poor signal, but nothing ever showed up. I even contacted customer support the next day, giving them the exact time and pickup location, but they said there was no record of any ride request from that area during that time period. They looked at me like I was crazy when I insisted I'd driven someone around for over 3 hours. I checked my phone's location history, thinking that would at least prove I'd been driving around all night, but even that was screwed up. According to my phone, I'd been sitting in the bowling alley parking lot from 10:30 p.m. until 2:15 a.m., not moving at all. But I know I burned through almost a full tank of gas that night. I had to fill up the next morning, and my car doesn't just burn gas sitting idle. I started questioning my own sanity, wondering if I'd had some kind of breakdown or micro-sleep episode, but I remembered every detail too clearly for it to have been a dream. The smell of that musty abandoned house, the sound of gravel under my tires, the way Derek's voice echoed when he said the other place. None of it felt like something my mind would have made up. For weeks after that night, I kept driving past the bowling alley, looking for that gravel road Derek had directed me to. I must have driven up and down Elm Street 50 times, checking every possible turnoff, but I never found it. It was like the road had just disappeared, or maybe had never existed in the first place. I even asked other drivers if they'd ever had any weird experiences picking up passengers from that bowling alley, but most of them avoided the area entirely because it was usually dead after the lockdown started. One guy told me he'd gotten a request from there once, but when he showed up, nobody was there, so he just left. I started wondering if Derek was even a real person, or if something else was using the app somehow. The whole thing messed with my head so much that I ended up quitting rideshare driving altogether. I couldn't handle the anxiety of not knowing who was going to get in my car, especially late at night. Every time I got a pickup request from an empty parking lot or an isolated area, I'd think about Derek and that cold breath on my neck, and I'd just cancel the ride. I know this all sounds completely insane, and I've never told anyone the full story because I know how it sounds, but I needed to get it off my chest somewhere. The really messed up part is that I started having dreams about that abandoned house for months afterward. Not nightmares exactly, but these weird, vivid dreams where I'm standing in front of it again, and I can see light coming from behind those boarded-up windows. In the dreams, I always know I'm supposed to go inside, like there's something in there that belongs to me, but I never actually do it. I wake up every time just as I'm reaching for the front door handle. I've tried looking up the area online, searching for abandoned properties or old houses in the woods off Elm Street, but nothing comes up. It's like that whole section of road exists in some kind of dead zone that the internet doesn't know about. The weird thing is, I've talked to people who've lived in this town their whole lives, and when I describe the route Derek had me take, they just give me blank stares. One old guy at the diner said there used to be some kind of private road back there decades ago, but it got washed out in a flood sometime in the 80s and was never rebuilt. But I know what I saw. That road was real. That house was real. And Derek was definitely real, even if he wasn't exactly normal. I still drive by the bowling alley sometimes, usually during the day when it feels safer, and I always look for that flickering streetlight where Derek was standing. The light's been fixed now. It doesn't flicker anymore, but sometimes I swear I can see a shadow standing there even when there's nobody around. My rational mind tells me it's just my imagination, trauma response or whatever, but my gut knows better. There's something off about that whole area, something that doesn't fit with the rest of the world. I've thought about going back at night, parking in the same spot and waiting to see if another request comes through, but honestly, I'm too scared of what might happen. What if Derek gets in my car again? What if he takes me to the other place this time, and I don't come back? Sometimes I wonder if I was supposed to figure out where the other place was, like maybe that was some kind of test I failed. But then I remember that cold breath on my neck and the way he said I'd picked the wrong guy up, and I think maybe failing that test was the best thing that could have happened to me. Whatever Derek was, wherever he needed to go, I'm glad I never found out. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some passengers are better left standing in empty parking lots. This happened back in August 2021, when I was still doing rideshare driving to make ends meet during all the COVID craziness. Most of my rides were pretty normal, people going to work, the airport, whatever, but this one still gives me chills when I think about it. I got a ping around 11 p.m. from this weird location that wasn't really an address, just GPS coordinates that led me to this random spot on the side of Highway 34, about 20 minutes outside of town. There was nothing there. No buildings, no businesses, just this gravel pull-off area next to a bunch of trees. I almost canceled the ride because it felt sketchy as hell, but gas prices were insane, and I needed every fare I could get. When I pulled up, there was this guy standing there in the dark, no streetlights or anything, just standing by the tree line like he'd been waiting there for hours. He was probably in his late 20s, wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt and khakis, like he'd been dressed up for something earlier, but had been through hell since then. His hair was messy, and he kept looking over his shoulder at the woods behind him, like he was expecting someone to follow him out. The guy walked over and got in the front passenger seat, which was already weird because most people sit in the back. "You Chris?" I asked, and he nodded but didn't say anything else. He had this intense, wild look in his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days, and his hands were shaking as he buckled his seatbelt. I could smell sweat on him, that nervous kind of sweat that comes from being really stressed out, and there were scratches on his arms like he'd been running through brush. When I asked him where we were going, he just said, "I'll tell you when we get on the road," and then pulled out his phone. I started driving back toward town, figuring he'd give me an address once we got going. But instead of looking at his phone normally, he turned on the flashlight and started shining it around the inside of my car, not like he was looking for something he'd dropped. He was deliberately pointing it at me, at the dashboard, at the windows, like he was checking to make sure everything was real. The light kept hitting my eyes in the rearview mirror, and I had to tell him to stop because it was messing with my night vision. "Sorry," he said, but he kept doing it anyway, just more sneakily, like he couldn't help himself. After about 10 minutes of this flashlight nonsense, Chris finally gave me an address on Maple Street, but when I put it in my GPS, it showed a residential area I wasn't familiar with. The whole drive there, he kept fidgeting with his phone, turning the flashlight on and off, and muttering things under his breath that I couldn't quite hear. Every few minutes, he'd shine the light toward me again, like he was checking to make sure I was still there or still the same person or something. When I asked him what he was doing, he just said, "making sure," but wouldn't explain what he was making sure of. The weird thing was, every time the light hit my face, I could see him staring at me with this intense, almost frantic expression, like he was studying me for some kind of test. His breathing was really shallow and fast, and he kept wiping his palms on his pants legs. I started getting seriously uncomfortable because the whole situation felt unstable, like he might flip out at any second. When we finally turned onto Maple Street, it was one of those older neighborhoods where the houses are spread far apart and most of the street lights are burned out. Chris had me drive to the very end of the street, where there was this house that looked completely dark and empty. The house was set back from the road behind a bunch of overgrown bushes and trees, and there were no cars in the driveway, no lights on anywhere. It looked like nobody had lived there in months. The grass was knee-high, newspapers were piled up on the porch, and there were final notice utility bills stuffed in the mailbox that was overflowing onto the ground. Chris stared at the house for a long time before getting out, and I could see his hands were shaking even worse now. "Wait here," he said, just like that Derek guy from my other nightmare ride, and something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. He walked up the driveway and disappeared around the side of the house, and I sat there wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into this time. The whole street was dead quiet, no traffic, no dogs barking, nothing. And the darkness around that house seemed thicker somehow, like it was swallowing up the light from my headlights. I waited for maybe 15 minutes, checking my phone and trying to decide if I should just leave, when I heard what sounded like someone shouting from inside the house. It was muffled and I couldn't make out words, but it sounded angry and desperate. Then everything went quiet again, and I didn't see Chris for another 20 minutes. When Chris finally came back, he looked even more shaken up than before. His shirt was torn at the shoulder and there was dirt on his knees like he'd been crawling around or had fallen down. He got back in the car without saying anything, slammed the door and just sat there breathing heavily for a minute. I asked him if everything was okay, but he just shook his head and said, "We need to leave, now." His voice was different, higher pitched, almost panicked, and he kept looking back at the house like something was going to come after us. I started driving away from the house, figuring the ride was over and I'd drop him back at that weird pickup spot. But then he told me to stop at the gas station on Miller Road. I thought maybe he needed to use the bathroom or buy something, so I pulled into the station and parked near the pumps. Chris got out and walked toward the store, but instead of going inside, he just stood there in the fluorescent light, staring back in the direction we'd come from. I was checking my phone to see how much the fare would be when I heard the passenger door open again. I looked up expecting to see Chris getting back in, but the thing is, I had locked the doors. I always lock the doors when I'm parked somewhere at night. It's just automatic. But somehow Chris was back in the passenger seat, even though I distinctly remembered hearing the click of the locks engaging. "I need to go back," Chris said, and his voice was flat now, emotionless, completely different from the panicked tone he'd had just minutes before. When I asked him what he meant, he said, "Back to where you picked me up, back to the beginning." I told him that was fine, but I was confused about how he'd gotten back in the car, and that's when he gave me this look like I was stupid. "I never got out," he said, but I knew that was impossible because I'd watched him walk toward the store. I even asked him about it, told him I'd seen him standing by the gas pumps, but he just stared at me like I was losing my mind. "I've been sitting right here the whole time," he insisted, and then he pulled out his phone and started with the flashlight thing again. This time he was shining it directly at my face, holding it steady, and I could see in the reflection on the windshield that his eyes looked completely different. Not panicked anymore, but cold and calculating. "They're still in the house," he said quietly, almost like he was talking to himself. "My parents are still in the house." The way he said it made my blood run cold, because it sounded like he was talking about something that had happened a long time ago, not something from 20 minutes earlier. I started driving back toward the highway, trying to process what Chris had just said about his parents still being in the house. The way he'd said it was so matter-of-fact, but also deeply disturbing, like he was stating something that should have been obvious but wasn't. I kept glancing over at him, and he was sitting perfectly still now, not fidgeting anymore, just holding his phone with the flashlight pointed down at his lap. The panicked, sweaty guy from earlier was completely gone, replaced by someone who seemed almost catatonic. When I asked him what he meant about his parents, he didn't answer for a long time. Then, without looking at me, he said, "They've been in there for 3 years now. They don't like visitors." His voice was so quiet I almost couldn't hear it over the engine noise. I didn't know what to say to that. Was he talking about dead parents? Were they sick? Was this some kind of mental health crisis? The whole situation felt way above my pay grade, but I was already committed to getting him back to his pickup spot. Every few minutes he'd lift his phone and shine the light toward me again, like he was checking to make sure I was still the same person driving. And each time he did it, I felt more uneasy. As we got closer to that weird pull-off area where I'd originally picked him up, Chris started getting agitated again. He was shifting in his seat, breathing faster, and I could see him gripping his phone so tight his knuckles were white. "They know I left," he said suddenly, and there was real fear in his voice now. "They always know when I leave." I asked him who they were, thinking maybe he was talking about his parents again, but he just shook his head like the question didn't make sense. When we finally reached the spot where I'd picked him up, it looked exactly the same, just this random gravel area next to the dark woods. No other cars, no signs of life. Chris sat there for a minute after I stopped, staring out at the tree line, and I could hear him breathing really heavily again. "This is where it started," he said, more to himself than to me. "This is where I always end up." Then he opened the door and got out, but instead of walking away, he leaned down and looked at me through the window. His face was right up against the glass, and in the glow from my dashboard lights, his eyes looked completely hollow, like there was nothing behind them. "Thanks for the ride," he said, but his voice sounded different again, younger, like a kid's voice. "See you next time." Before I could ask what he meant by next time, he turned and walked into the woods, and the darkness just swallowed him up completely. I sat there for a few minutes after Chris disappeared, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The whole ride felt like some kind of fever dream, especially that thing with the locked doors at the gas station. I kept replaying it in my mind, and I was absolutely certain I had locked the car and watched him get out. But his insistence that he'd never left was so convincing that I started doubting my own memory. I checked my phone to see the trip details, expecting to see a normal fare from the coordinates to Maple Street and back, but the GPS tracking showed something impossible. According to the app, I'd driven from the pickup point to the house on Maple Street, but then instead of going to the gas station, it showed me driving in circles around the same block for over an hour before returning to the pickup point. But I remembered the gas station clearly. The fluorescent lights, Chris standing by the pumps, the whole weird door-locking thing. None of it made sense, and looking at that GPS track made me feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I tried calling the customer service line to report the glitch, but when I gave them the ride details, they told me there was no record of any fare to that address. Just like with Derek, it was like the ride had never happened, except this time I had scratches on my car seats where Chris had been gripping them. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what Chris had said about his parents being in the house for 3 years. Something about the way he'd said it stuck with me, so I decided to drive by the house on Maple Street during daylight to see if I could figure out what was going on. When I got there, the house looked even more abandoned than it had the night before. The "for sale" sign in the yard was so faded and weather-beaten that I could barely read the realtor's name, and when I called the number, it was disconnected. I asked around the neighborhood, and an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down told me the family who used to live there had moved away suddenly about 3 years ago. She said it was a young couple with a son in his 20s who had some kind of mental health problems. Poor boy, she said, always seemed so lost. His parents tried everything, but he just kept getting worse. One day they were just gone, packed up and left in the middle of the night. When I asked if she knew what happened to the son, she got this sad look and said, "Oh honey, he died in a car accident right after they moved. Such a tragedy. I heard his parents never got over it." The timeline didn't make sense though. If the son died 3 years ago, who was Chris? And why did he talk about his parents like they were still in that empty house? I started doing some research online, searching for car accidents and deaths in the area from around 3 years ago. It took me hours of digging through local news archives and obituaries, but I finally found what I was looking for. Christopher Michael Hayes, age 28, died in a single car accident on Highway 34 in September 2018, just 3 months after his family had moved away from the house on Maple Street. According to the article, he'd been struggling with severe depression and paranoid episodes, and his parents had relocated to try to get him away from whatever was triggering his mental health issues. The accident happened late at night. His car went off the road and hit a tree in almost the exact spot where I'd picked up Chris. The article mentioned that he'd been driving erratically and had called his parents multiple times that night, saying he needed to go back to the house and that they were waiting for him there. His parents told police he'd been having delusions about voices calling him back to their old home, and they'd been trying to get him psychiatric help. The funeral was held at a small church across town, and according to the obituary, his parents moved out of state shortly after to start fresh somewhere Christopher could finally be at peace. But here's the thing that really messed me up. I drove back to that pull-off area on Highway 34 the next weekend, just to see it in daylight and maybe put the whole thing to rest in my mind. There were still skid marks on the asphalt from where cars had pulled over, and about 50 feet into the trees, I could see rusted metal and broken glass scattered around the base of a large oak tree. The accident site was still there, never cleaned up, just left to be reclaimed by the forest. I walked closer and found pieces of what looked like a phone case and some faded fabric caught on the branches. Standing there in broad daylight, surrounded by normal forest sounds and sunshine, the whole thing seemed less scary and more just sad. But as I was walking back to my car, I heard my phone buzz with a ride request notification. The pickup location was showing as the exact spot where I was standing, and the passenger name was Chris. My hands were shaking as I canceled the request, and I drove home as fast as I could. I never went back to that area again, and I quit driving rideshare completely about a month later. Sometimes I wonder if Chris is still out there, still trying to get rides back to that empty house on Maple Street, still looking for his parents who moved away 3 years ago and never came back for him. I'm 18 and just moved into my first apartment about 2 months ago. It's this tiny one-bedroom place on the second floor of an older building. Nothing fancy, but it's mine and I love the independence. My parents were worried about me living alone, especially since the neighborhood isn't the greatest. But I convinced them I'd be fine. I work part-time at a coffee shop and go to community college, so money's always tight, which means I eat a lot of cheap takeout instead of cooking. This happened last Thursday night. I'd been studying for a psychology exam all day and was starving, so around 9 p.m., I ordered Chinese food through Uber Eats. Just some basic stuff, orange chicken and fried rice, nothing special. I was tracking the order on my phone and saw the driver was about 10 minutes away, so I put on some real clothes since I'd been in pajamas all day and waited by the door. My apartment faces the back of the building, and there's this little courtyard area with some bushes and a parking lot where most people park. The front entrance is around the corner, so delivery drivers usually have to walk around the building to find the right apartment numbers. I was expecting to hear a knock on my door any minute when instead I heard this loud knocking from my neighbor across the hall. Mrs. Chen is this sweet older lady who's lived here for like 20 years, and she usually keeps to herself, so it was weird for her to be knocking on my door at 9 p.m. When I opened it, she was holding my bag of Chinese food and had this really concerned look on her face. "Honey," she said, "I took this from the delivery man because he was acting very strange." I was confused and asked her what she meant, and she explained that she'd been watching TV when she heard someone walking around outside. When she looked out her window, she saw the delivery guy standing in the courtyard, not heading toward the front entrance like he should have been, but just standing there staring up at the building. She said he had his phone out like he was taking pictures. and then he walked closer to the building and was definitely looking through the ground floor windows. He stood under your window for at least 5 minutes, she told me, just staring up at it like he was studying it. Mrs. Chen said she got worried and went outside to confront him, and when she asked for the food to bring to me, he seemed annoyed but handed it over and left. The whole thing gave me chills, but I thanked her and figured maybe the guy was just new and didn't know how to find the front entrance. I ate my dinner and tried to put the whole thing out of my mind, telling myself Mrs. Chen might have misunderstood what she saw. Maybe the delivery guy was just confused about the building layout or had bad cell service and was trying to call me. But something about her expression when she'd brought me the food stuck with me. She looked genuinely scared, not just concerned. Mrs. Chen has lived here long enough to see all kinds of weird stuff, so for her to be that worried meant something was really off. I finished studying around midnight and was getting ready for bed when I remembered I hadn't rated the delivery or left a tip yet. When I opened the app to do that, I noticed something strange. The driver's profile photo showed a guy who looked way younger than what Mrs. Chen had described. She'd said he seemed like he was in his 30s or 40s, kind of scruffy looking, but the photo showed someone who looked barely older than me. I figured maybe the photo was old or the account belonged to someone else in his family, which happens sometimes with these gig jobs. I gave him 3 stars instead of 5 because of the weird window thing and went to brush my teeth. I was just about to turn off the lights and go to bed when I heard this sound that made my blood run cold. It was banging. Not knocking like someone at the front door, but actual banging, like someone hitting something hard with their fist or maybe a rock. The sound was coming from the direction of my bedroom window, which faces that same courtyard where Mrs. Chen had seen the delivery guy earlier. I froze in my bathroom with my toothbrush still in my mouth, listening to see if I'd imagined it. But then it happened again. 3 loud bangs, definitely coming from outside my window. My heart started racing as I crept toward my bedroom, staying low so whoever was out there couldn't see me. I carefully pulled back just the edge of my curtain and looked down into the courtyard, and I swear I almost threw up from fear. There was a car parked in the lot that I'd never seen before. This beat-up sedan with the engine running and the headlights off. I couldn't see anyone walking around, but I knew someone had been banging on something down there just 30 seconds ago. The worst part was that I recognized the car. It was the same make and model as the one shown in the Uber Eats tracking when my food was being delivered. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone was outside my apartment and I thought it might be the food delivery guy from earlier. The 911 dispatcher told me to stay away from the windows and keep my doors locked while they sent a patrol car over. I was hiding in my bathroom with the lights off, clutching my phone and trying to stay quiet, when I heard footsteps outside. Not just walking footsteps, but someone deliberately moving around the building, like they were looking for something specific. The footsteps would stop for a few seconds at a time, then continue, and I realized whoever it was probably checking each ground floor window before moving to the next one. My apartment is on the 2nd floor, but the way the building is designed, someone could easily climb up to my window if they really wanted to. I heard the footsteps stop right below my bedroom window, and then there was this scraping sound, like someone was dragging something across the ground to stand on. I was absolutely terrified that this guy was going to climb up and break my window, so I called 911 again and told them it was urgent, that someone was actively trying to get into my apartment. The dispatcher said the officers were 2 minutes away, but 2 minutes felt like 2 hours when I was sitting there in the dark, wondering if this psycho was about to come crashing through my window. When the police finally arrived, I heard car doors slamming and voices outside, and then everything went quiet. One of the officers came to my front door and I let him in. He was this older guy, probably in his 50s, who had that calm, reassuring way of talking that made me feel a little safer. He told me they'd found the car I described parked in the lot, but it was empty and the engine was off. They'd also found footprints in the muddy area under my window, and it looked like someone had been standing there for a while and had possibly tried to boost themselves up higher. The officer asked me to describe what had happened with the food delivery, and when I told him about Mrs. Chen's story and the banging sounds, he got this serious look on his face. "We're going to patrol the area for the next few hours," he said, "and I want you to call immediately if you see or hear anything else unusual." He gave me his card and told me to keep my curtains closed and my doors locked, which honestly made me feel worse because it confirmed that this wasn't just some misunderstanding. After the police left, I tried to sleep but kept hearing every little sound. The building settling, neighbors walking around, cars in the parking lot. Every time I started to doze off, I'd jerk awake thinking I heard that banging sound again. I barely slept that night, and when I did manage to drift off, I had these awful dreams about someone climbing through my window. I kept my phone right next to me and probably checked the locks on my door about 20 times before morning. When the sun finally came up, I felt a little safer and decided to go talk to Mrs. Chen to get more details about what she'd seen. She invited me in for coffee and told me she'd been thinking about the delivery guy all night too. Something was very wrong with that man, she said, and then she described him in more detail. He was probably in his late 30s, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face, and he had this weird way of moving, like he was trying not to be seen but also didn't care if anyone was watching. She said when she confronted him about the food, he didn't seem surprised or embarrassed like a normal person would if they'd been caught doing something inappropriate. Instead, he just stared at her with this blank expression and handed over the bag without saying a word. His eyes were very strange, Mrs. Chen told me, like he was looking right through me. She also mentioned that she'd seen the same car in the parking lot a few other times over the past couple of weeks, always late at night, but she'd assumed it belonged to someone visiting another tenant. The next few days were relatively normal, and I started to think maybe the guy had gotten scared off by the police and wouldn't come back. I was still being extra careful, keeping my curtains closed, checking the parking lot before going outside, stuff like that, but I was starting to feel like maybe I'd overreacted. Then on Sunday night, exactly 6 days after the first incident, I ordered food again. I know it was probably stupid, but I was starving and didn't have anything in my fridge, and I figured lightning wouldn't strike twice. This time I ordered from a different restaurant and made sure to put in the delivery instructions that the driver should come to the front entrance and call me when they arrived. I was watching the tracking on my phone when the driver got close, and I saw his car pull into the parking lot. But instead of coming to the front entrance like I'd requested, I watched through my peephole as the same beat-up sedan from the other night parked in the exact same spot. My heart started pounding as I realized this psycho had somehow gotten access to another delivery account, or maybe he was just hanging around the area waiting for me to order food again. I immediately called 911 and told them the guy from the other night was back, and this time I had proof he was deliberately targeting me. The police got there faster this time, and I watched from my window as 2 patrol cars surrounded the sedan in the parking lot. I could see the delivery guy, the same one Mrs. Chen had described, trying to act casual as the officers approached his car, but he was clearly nervous. One of the cops was talking to him while the other one was writing something down, probably running his license plates or checking his ID. I stayed on the phone with the 911 dispatcher the whole time, giving them a play-by-play of what I could see. After about 10 minutes, I watched the officers let him go, and he drove away. But one of the patrol cars followed him out of the parking lot. The officer who had been here the first night came up to talk to me, and he explained that they couldn't arrest the guy just for being in the parking lot, but they documented everything and told him he wasn't allowed to return to the property. The problem is, the officer said, he claims he was just here to deliver your food, and technically that's his job. But then he told me something that made my skin crawl. When they ran the guy's information, they found out he'd been fired from the delivery company 2 weeks ago for inappropriate conduct involving other female customers. He was using someone else's account to keep making deliveries, which explained why the profile photo didn't match. The officer told me they were going to file a report and contact the delivery company about the account fraud, but he was honest with me about the limitations of what they could do. Unless he actually tries to break in or physically threatens you, he said, we can't do much more than tell him to stay away. He suggested I consider staying somewhere else for a few days while they investigated, but I didn't really have anywhere to go, and I couldn't afford a hotel. That night, I barely slept again, jumping at every sound and constantly checking to make sure my door was locked. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. I held my breath and listened as the footsteps stopped right outside my door. I could see the shadow of someone's feet blocking the light that usually comes under my door from the hallway. Whoever it was just stood there for what felt like forever, and I was too scared to move or even breathe normally. Then I heard the softest sound, like someone was turning a doorknob very slowly, testing to see if it was locked. I grabbed my phone and called 911 again, whispering that someone was trying to get into my apartment right now. By the time the police arrived, whoever had been at my door was gone, but they found something that confirmed my worst fears. The officer checked the hallway and found fresh muddy footprints leading from the stairwell to my door and back again, And when he examined my door more closely, he could see scratches around the lock like someone had been trying to pick it or force it open. "This guy is escalating," the officer told me grimly. "First he was just watching, then he was trying to get your attention by banging on things, and now he's attempting to get into your apartment." He called for a detective to come take photos of the evidence and told me they were going to stake out the building for the next few nights. I was relieved but also terrified, because it meant this wasn't going to end anytime soon. The detective who showed up was this no-nonsense woman in her 40s who made me feel a little more confident that they were taking this seriously. She took detailed photos of the footprints and the scratches on my door, and she also dusted for fingerprints on the doorknob and frame. "We're going to catch this guy," she told me, "but in the meantime, you need to be extra careful. Consider changing your routine, maybe stay with friends or family for a while." The next morning, I called in sick to work and my classes because I was exhausted and paranoid. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway or a car door slam in the parking lot, I thought it was him coming back. Mrs. Chen came over to check on me and brought me some tea, and she told me she'd been keeping watch from her window whenever she could. "I saw that same car drive by 3 times yesterday," she said, "just cruising slowly through the parking lot like he was checking to see if you were home." That afternoon, the detective called me with an update that both relieved and horrified me. They'd identified the guy from the fingerprints on my door. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had a record of stalking and harassment charges from 2 other states. He'd apparently been using multiple fake accounts with different delivery companies to get access to women's addresses, and I wasn't his first victim. "The good news is we know who he is now," the detective said, "and we've got enough evidence to get a warrant for his arrest. The bad news is we haven't located him yet. The address on his driver's license is fake, and he's been staying in different motels around town." She told me they were confident they'd find him soon, but until then, I needed to assume he was still out there and still fixated on me. That evening, I was sitting in my living room with all the lights off, trying to watch TV, but mostly just staring at my phone waiting for updates from the police. Around 8 p.m., Mrs. Chen knocked on my door and told me she'd seen Marcus's car parked across the street from our building, just sitting there with the engine running. I called the detective immediately, and she said they'd send units over right away. But by the time they arrived, the car was gone. This cat and mouse game went on for 2 more days. I'd get reports from neighbors or see the car myself, call the police, and then he'd disappear before they could get there. It was like he knew exactly how long he could stay before the cops showed up, and he was playing with all of us. I was becoming a nervous wreck, barely eating, not sleeping, jumping at every sound. The detective told me they were close to tracking down where he was staying, but close wasn't good enough when this psycho was circling my building like a shark. On Wednesday night, I was so exhausted I actually fell asleep on my couch around 10 p.m., which was the first real sleep I'd gotten in almost a week. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of someone knocking on my front door. Not banging like before, but normal knocking, like a friend might do when they come to visit. For a split second, I thought maybe it was Mrs. Chen or one of the police officers, but then I remembered that any legitimate visitor would have called first, especially at 2 a.m. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole, and my heart almost stopped. Marcus was standing right there in the hallway, maybe 3 feet from my door, wearing the same baseball cap Mrs. Chen had described. He looked exactly like his mugshot that the detective had shown me. Thin face, stubble, these cold, empty eyes that seemed to look right through everything. He knocked again, and this time he spoke. "I know you're in there," he said in this eerily calm voice. "I just want to talk to you. I've been trying to see you for weeks." His voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it 1,000 times more terrifying than if he'd been yelling or threatening me. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering that the stalker was at my door right now, and the dispatcher told me to stay quiet and away from the door until officers arrived. But Marcus must have heard me talking because he started knocking harder and saying my name, which completely freaked me out because I'd never told him my name. He must have gotten it from my delivery orders or done some kind of research on me. The knocking got more insistent, and Marcus started saying things that made it clear he'd been watching me for way longer than just the past week. "I know you work at the coffee shop on 5th Street, he said through the door, "and I know you drive the blue Honda. I've been trying to find the right time to introduce myself." His voice was still eerily calm, like he genuinely thought this was normal behavior. Like showing up at someone's apartment at 2 a.m. after stalking them was just his way of being friendly. I could hear sirens in the distance getting closer, And I guess Marcus heard them too because his tone suddenly changed. "You called the cops on me again," he said, and now he sounded hurt and angry, like I'd betrayed him somehow. "I just wanted to meet you properly. All those other times there were always interruptions." He started rattling the doorknob, and I could hear him pushing against the door, testing how solid it was. The deadbolt held, but the door frame was old and I wasn't sure how much force it could take. "I brought you something," he said, and his voice was right against the door now, like he had his mouth pressed to the wood. "I've been carrying it around for days, waiting for the right moment." I had no idea what he was talking about, but the idea of this psycho carrying around some kind of gift for me made me feel sick. The sirens were getting really close now, and I could see red and blue lights flashing in the hallway under my door. Marcus must have realized the police were about to arrive because he started talking faster, more frantically. "This isn't over," he said. "I know where you work. I know your schedule. I know everything about you. You can't hide from me forever." Then I heard footsteps running down the hallway toward the stairwell, and a few seconds later I heard the heavy footsteps of police officers coming up the stairs. There was a lot of shouting and radio chatter, and then one of the officers knocked on my door and identified himself. When I let him in, he told me they'd caught Marcus trying to escape through the back exit of the building, and this time they had enough evidence to arrest him on multiple charges: stalking, attempted breaking and entering, harassment, and violating the restraining order they'd filed earlier that day. The officer also told me they'd found something in Marcus's car that explained his comment about bringing me something. He'd been carrying around this creepy scrapbook filled with photos of me that he'd taken without my knowledge. Pictures of me walking to my car, going into the coffee shop, even some taken through my apartment window with a telephoto lens. There were also printed copies of my social media posts and what looked like a detailed schedule of my daily routine.